They said marriage makes you a real man, that it gives you respect, stability, a family, a life built on solid ground. But somewhere along the way, that promise changed. For a growing number of men, marriage no longer feels like a foundation, and now why marriage and worry. It feels like a trap disguised as tradition. They told us that a ring means you've arrived, that love means safety, that commitment means forever. But forever isn't what it used to be. Today, more men are walking away from the altar, not because they fear love, but because they finally read the fine print. And if you're one of them, you're not crazy. You're aware. I grew up believing marriage was the finish line. My father wore his wedding band like a badge of honor. My mother used to say, "Find a good woman. Build a good life." Simple advice, beautiful on paper. So, I followed the rules, worked hard, saved money, tried to be the kind of man worth building with, because that's what we were taught. Be loyal, be dependable, be the rock. But what they never told us is that being the rock also means being the one that breaks first. Marriage used to be a partnership. Now it feels like a merger, and every merger has risk. A few years ago, I met a man named James in Dallas. He was 52, divorced, 2 kids. He owned a small business, the kind you build from nothing but your own hands and your own hope. He told me something I'll never forget. He said, "I didn't lose my marriage overnight. I lost it in small moments. In the silence between dinner and bedtime, in the nights when we stopped talking, but also stopped fighting. That's how you know it's over, not when there's noise. But when there's none." He wasn't bitter. He was just tired. Tired of being the only one still holding the line. When the divorce came, it didn't come as a surprise. What surprised him was how quickly the love story turned into a legal one. The same system that celebrated his wedding now calculated his losses. The same judge who said congratulations years ago now told him when he could see his kids. He said, "It's strange, isn't it? You can spend 20 years building a home, and in a single signature, it no longer belongs to you." He laughed when he said it. But it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that hides behind acceptance. That's when it hit me. Men aren't walking away from marriage because they're afraid of commitment. They're walking away because they've seen what happens when commitment becomes collateral. Every man knows someone like James. A friend, a co-worker, a brother, someone who believed love would protect him, only to realize love has no protection clause. They call it division of assets. But really, it's the division of a life. The house you built becomes an address you visit. The kids you raised become weekends on a schedule. The woman who once said, "I'll stand by you," now stands across the courtroom with a lawyer who calls you by your last name. No one prepares you for that part. No one tells you that love can end quietly. But the paperwork is loud. That's when men start to think differently. Not colder, just clearer. They look at the system and ask, how did we get here? When did a promise become a penalty? When did love become liability? See, this isn't about hating women. It's about understanding the rules before you play. Because every contract has fine print, and most men never read it until it's too late. Marriage isn't evil. It's just outdated. It's a framework built for a time that doesn't exist anymore. Back when one person stayed home, and the other worked. Back when roles were clear, expectations were balanced, and community still held couples together. But that world is gone, and the contract never changed. So when men say, "I'll pass," it's not rebellion. It's self-preservation. They're not running from love. They're just refusing to gamble everything on rules that were written for another century. They still want connection. They still crave companionship, but they're not willing to pay for it with their peace, their home, and their future. Because when you strip away the ceremonies and the promises, what most men really want isn't escape, it's fairness. And until the system offers that, many are choosing freedom over forever. If you ask them why, they'll say, "I've seen what happens when you give everything to something that gives nothing back." And that's not fear talking, that's experience. After the divorce, James told me something that stuck. He said, "Marriage isn't about love anymore. It's about leverage." At first, I thought he was just bitter, but then I looked around and realized he wasn't wrong. The system that used to protect families now profits when they fall apart. 2 households instead of 1. 2 taxpayers instead of 1. 2 lives that used to be shared now separated, processed, and billed by the hour. The more I watched, the more I saw the pattern. Men don't lose in marriage because they stop loving. They lose because once the papers are signed, they no longer own the rules. Let's be honest, the system wasn't built for today. It was written decades ago, in a world where a man worked and a woman stayed home. Back then, that made sense. He earned, she cared for the family. Both gave up something. Both gained something. But that balance doesn't exist anymore. The world changed. The laws didn't. Now, even if both partners work full-time, the courts often treat men as the permanent providers. And when the marriage fails, the same system that once called you husband now calls you obligated. You're no longer a man with dreams. You're a line on a spreadsheet. One afternoon, I sat in a courtroom watching another case before mine, a man in his 50s. Blue suit, hands shaking as the judge spoke. His wife sat across the room. No eye contact. Just silence. The judge said, "Support will continue indefinitely." And that was it. You could see it on his face. The disbelief, the realization that 20 years of effort had been reduced to 1 sentence. He wasn't angry. He was hollow. Because that's the moment it hits most men, not when the love ends, but when they see how little their effort matters in the fine print of the law. That's when you begin to question everything. What does partnership even mean when one side carries all the liability? What's the point of loyalty if the system rewards whoever leaves first? Love should be about connection, not control. But once lawyers get involved, love becomes negotiation. And negotiation never feels like home. I remember talking to a younger guy once, 28, never married. He told me he's in no rush. He's seen what happened to his father, his uncle, his co-workers. He said, "Why would I sign a contract where failure means losing half my life? But success means getting nothing extra?" I couldn't argue with him. Because at its core, marriage today is a gamble, where the jackpot is peace, and the penalty is poverty. Some people hear this and say, men are afraid of responsibility. But that's not it. Men carry responsibility every day. They work. They pay. They build. They just don't want to play a game that punishes them for showing up. The truth is, most men still want to love deeply. They just don't want to sign away their freedom to prove it. Because love shouldn't require legal approval. It should require mutual respect. And respect doesn't come from a court order. When I look at my own life now, I understand why so many men are cautious. They've watched friends lose everything. They've watched fathers get replaced. They've seen uncles sleeping in apartments with folding chairs and half custody. They've watched men spend decades recovering from one signature. And all for what? To be called selfish because they finally said, "No, not like this." Some people call that cynicism. I call it awareness. Because awareness doesn't kill love. It saves it. It forces you to ask better questions, to look beyond the flowers and the photos and see the framework holding it all together. You can love a woman and still question the institution. You can value connection without surrendering control. That's not fear, that's wisdom. The men who walk away aren't broken. They're observant. They've learned from what came before them. Their fathers stayed and suffered. Their friends gave everything and got nothing in return. So they choose differently. They choose peace over proof. And that's not weakness. That's evolution. I think about my friend James again sometimes. He still believes in love. He just believes in a different kind. One built on honesty, not obligation. One that doesn't need a legal system to prove its worth. He once told me, "If I ever marry again, it'll be a handshake, not a contract." He smiled when he said it. A small smile, the kind that comes from a man who's finally learned the cost of believing blindly. Men aren't avoiding marriage because they hate women. They're avoiding the system that turned love into a liability. They still believe in connection, in partnership, in loyalty, but they're learning to define it for themselves. Because maybe the future of love isn't in the courthouse. Maybe it's in clarity. Maybe clarity is the new romance. Because once a man understands the system, he stops confusing comfort with love and silence with peace. He learns that not everything sacred needs a ceremony, and not every promise needs a paper trail. That's the truth most men are waking up to, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in quiet awareness. I used to think marriage was the highest form of commitment. Now, I think awareness is. Commitment without awareness is just loyalty to an illusion. It's staying in a room that's already on fire because someone told you that leaving makes you weak. But walking away isn't weakness. It's self-respect. It's refusing to let guilt keep you tied to something that stopped being mutual long ago. You can still honor love without sacrificing yourself to it. I once asked an older man, divorced twice, in his 60s, if he'd ever marry again. He smiled and said, "No, but I'll still love again. I just won't outsource my happiness to paperwork." That line stayed with me, because it's not love that men are afraid of. It's losing themselves inside a system that doesn't value what they give. Most men don't need perfection. They don't even need guarantees. They just want fairness. They want respect. They want to know that if they build something with someone, it won't be turned against them later. When you talk to men who've been through it, they don't sound bitter. They sound awake. They've seen how quickly love can turn into leverage, how easily kindness can be mistaken for compliance, and how silence often becomes the language of the defeated. They're not running from love. They're redefining what it means to love wisely. Marriage, as it stands, is still a beautiful idea, but it's built on an outdated foundation. It still runs on rules that assume one person stays home and the other pays the bills. That world doesn't exist anymore. Today's men aren't asking for sympathy. They're asking for balance. They're asking for the freedom to love without being punished for it later. Because a contract written in another century can't define what love means in this one. Love today looks different. It's two people who both work, who both carry their own weight, and choose each other freely. Not out of dependency, but out of alignment. It's about honesty, not obligation. Mutual growth, not mutual control. Love isn't dying, it's evolving. And the men who say no to marriage aren't rejecting love, they're protecting it. They're keeping it safe from the machinery that monetizes it. I think that's what scares people the most. Not that men don't want to love, but that they're no longer willing to do it blindly. The illusion of security is fading. The promise of forever is being replaced with something more grounded. Not forever, but for as long as it's real. Because the truth is, love doesn't need forever to be meaningful. It just needs honesty. It needs awareness. It needs two people willing to grow in the same direction without owning each other. Some call this the death of tradition. I call it the birth of clarity. The end of an illusion that made men believe their value only existed inside a contract. For decades, men were told their worth was measured by what they could provide. Now, they're realizing their worth comes from what they can protect: their peace, their time, and their freedom. That's not selfishness. That's survival. So where does that leave us? In a new chapter. One where men aren't ashamed to choose differently. One where love doesn't require surrender. Where peace is not loneliness, but liberation. The modern man doesn't need permission to love differently. He just needs the courage to do it consciously. Because real love, the kind that lasts, doesn't thrive in contracts. It thrives in clarity. James told me once, "I used to think marriage was my greatest achievement. Now I see that peace is." He still loves deeply. He still believes in connection. But he no longer believes that love has to cost him everything to prove it's real. That's the lesson so many men are learning quietly. Not from statistics, not from podcasts, but from experience. You can give love without giving away yourself. You can build a life without signing it over. And that's what freedom looks like. So, if you're listening to this, and you're a man who still believes in love, don't stop. Just don't believe it's guaranteed by a signature. Love her with truth. Not titles. With presence. Not promises. Because love isn't a finish line. It's a choice you renew every day. And the men who understand that will love better, live freer, and lose less. Marriage isn't the problem. Blind faith is. Love isn't the enemy. Illusion is. And maybe, just maybe, the men who walk away from the old rules are the ones finally brave enough to love with their eyes open.